This week's episode is brought to you by Away. Away was founded by two friends from New York who found themselves at JFK with dead phones, delayed flights, and a bright idea. Luggage with power. Thus, the Away carry-on was born. After asking thousands of people how they pack, why they travel, and what bugs them the most about their luggage, they designed a bag that solved a few old problems, like sticky wheels, and a few new ones too, like dead cell phones. Away uses high-quality materials while offering a much lower price compared to other brands by cutting out the middleman and selling directly to you. You can choose from 9 colors and 4 sizes: the carry-on, the bigger carry-on, the medium, and the large. All the suitcases are made with premium German polycarbonate, unrivaled in strength and impact resistance, and also very lightweight. The interior features a patent-pending compression system, which is helpful for overpackers. 4 360-degree spinner wheels guarantee a smooth ride, and both sizes of the carry-on are able to charge all cell phones, tablets, e-readers, and anything else powered by a USB cord. A single charge from the Away carry-on will charge your iPhone 5 times. An Away bag also comes with a 100-day trial, so you can live with it, travel with it, Instagram it, and if at any point you decide it's not for you, you can return it for a full refund, no questions asked. It also comes with a lifetime warranty, so if anything breaks, Away will fix it or replace it for you, for life. My Away carry-on bag has become a staple of my traveling life. It has treated me very well, it's durable, it fits in all the overhead compartments, so that's never a problem. I never run out of batteries when I'm at the airport or on the phone, and seriously, I'm not sure how I ever lived without 360-degree spinner wheels. So, when you are done with this episode, get $20 off a suitcase by visiting awaytravel.com/revolutions and using the promo code REVOLUTIONS at checkout. That again is awaytravel.com/revolutions and use the promo code REVOLUTIONS. Hello, and welcome to Revolutions. Episode 7.27, The Flight of the Pope. Last time, we brought events in Vienna to a final climactic head as the imperial capital rose up one last time in October of 1848, the Hungarian army failed to relieve the besieged insurgents, and the iron screw of Habsburg counter-revolution started to turn very deep. And one thing we know for sure is that the conservatives at the Habsburg court were able to turn that counter-revolutionary screw, in large part because Field Marshal Radetzky had defeated the armies of King Charles Albert of Piedmont at the Battle of Custoza in late July 1848. This Austrian victory had dealt a body blow to the cause of Italian liberation and unification, a cause that had already been dealt a number of body blows. King Ferdinand of the Two Sicilies had dragged his feet joining the effort. Then, after he had cracked down on liberal patriots in Naples on May the 15th, he recalled all his troops from the field. Tuscany had been knocked out of the war by the Austrians in part because the Tuscans and Piedmontese couldn't work together. But most importantly, the Pope had issued his devastating allocution that withdrew God's support from the war. All of these failures combined to bring pan-Italian liberal monarchism into some disrepute. Certainly the shine had worn off Charles Albert as the natural and necessary leader of Risorgimento. This would leave the Italian peninsula open to a contest between radical Republicans, led by, for example, Giuseppe Mazzini, and old-style conservatives who believed that they could now turn Italy back to the status quo ante 1848. Both of them believed that the Battle of Custoza meant that their time was at hand. Across the peninsula, the liberal governments of the Italian states that had been established in February and March, and then who had gone on to support the King's War, were now discredited by his defeat. In Piedmont itself, a ministry only recently formed under the former mayor of Milan, Gabriele Casati, he was one of the leaders of the 5 Days of Milan, resigned in the face of mounting public pressure. Radicals in Genoa started organizing and popping off about how if the king didn't start the war again soon, that they were going to overthrow him. To try to head this off, a new ministry formed under the king promised an additional 50,000-man levy, but all of this put Charles Albert on notice that the armistice he had signed with Austria better be a pause, not a stop. The 25,000 or so refugee Lombards who would like to go home at some point were also an ever-present reminder. In the teeth of all this, the king and his new government audaciously called for a convention of Italians to come to Turin and work out how the new unified northern Italian kingdom would operate, and possibly incorporate further territory. All this while Piedmont was in retreat, and all those little plebiscites throughout Lombardy, Venetia, where they had all voted to fuse with Piedmont, well, those votes now amounted to exactly diddly squat. Down in Tuscany, a liberal government that had been appointed in March was brought down after Florence erupted with riots from students and returning soldiers and Mazzini's Republican agents. The Grand Duchy was then hit again on August the 23rd by riots in the port city of Livorno, after the arrest of a radical leader, a hellfire-breathing friar who still wanted to make this all a holy war. Now, order was restored, but the Tuscan radicals, many aligned with Mazzini, were now calling for a pan-Italian constitutional convention of their own, this one to organize Italy along republican lines, not the monarchical lines advanced by the guys up in Turin. So in both Piedmont and Tuscany, radical voices were making advances in the wake of the king's defeat. Meanwhile, in Lombardy, where the king had been defeated, there had been a brief hope of continuing the war after Piedmont's withdrawal, but it did not last very long. When Charles Albert signed the armistice and abandoned Milan, about half the residents of the city, including most of the leadership of the anti-Austrian insurgency, followed him. But Giuseppe Mazzini did not. He felt personally betrayed by the king after that false choice referendum, the one where the question posed was not, do we fuse with Piedmont, but do we fuse with Piedmont now or later? The king's retreat was only further proof that Charles Albert was not the leader Italy needed. So Mazzini himself grabbed a pistol and departed Milan on August the 3rd, but he did not follow the others to Piedmont. Instead, he and a few of his followers headed north into Switzerland, where Mazzini set up a new base in exile. He formed what he called the Italian National Committee of Defense, that would be tasked with coordinating action among radical Republicans on the peninsula to keep the cause of liberation and unification going. But now for the people, not for kings and popes. And he wrote that the royal war is over. The people's war begins. Mazzini was not the only hardcore Republican who stayed in Lombardy. The Republican leader of a small band of about 800 freedom fighters also eschewed retreating to Piedmont and instead headed north into the high lake country of Lombardy, around Lake Como, to continue what would now be a guerrilla war. The leader of this band has a name that should be recognizable to you, as it is a name that is almost synonymous with Risorgimento. That name, Giuseppe Garibaldi. Now, he is a latecomer to our podcast because he didn't come back to Italy until the summer of 1848. That's because he was off fighting in the various civil wars of post-independent South America. So, let's stop for a moment and talk about Giuseppe Garibaldi. Garibaldi was born in 1807 in Nice, which was at that moment a fully integrated part of the French Empire, but which would be given back to the Kingdom of Piedmont-Sardinia at the Congress of Vienna. Young Garibaldi grew up steeped in the local sailing culture, and by 1832 was a minted captain of a merchant ship. Still only in his mid-20s, Garibaldi met a member of Mazzini's Young Italy movement in the spring of 1833, and fired up by Republican patriotic idealism, Garibaldi joined Young Italy. He then met Mazzini personally for the first time in November of 1833 in Geneva, as Mazzini was putting the finishing touches on a planned revolt down in the Kingdom of Piedmont. So young Garibaldi joined a Carbonari Large and joined in the attempt in February 1834. But this is one of those long string of failed revolutions in Italy in the 1820s and 1830s, and Garibaldi had to flee the country, sentenced to death in absentia, an order signed by, you guessed it, King Charles Albert. Garibaldi made his way from Marseille to North Africa, and from there took a mighty big plunge. Leaving Europe behind, he sailed for whatever opportunities might present themselves in South America. The continent was still trying to sort itself out after the Great Wars of Independence, and when Garibaldi landed in Brazil in 1836, he landed in the middle of a civil war, with some provinces of the Brazilian Empire having declared themselves the Republic of the Rio Grande do Sul. Garibaldi entered this war with the Republicans, and put his expert seamanship to good work, and also getting his first taste of fighting on land. But most importantly in Brazil, Garibaldi met and fell in love with Ana Ribeiro de Silva, a patriotic fighter of tremendous passion. She became Garibaldi's lover and comrade in arms, and she was known to him and to history as simply Anita. The couple moved south to Montevideo in 1841, though, and attempted a quieter life where Garibaldi was a merchant and sometimes teacher. And while they lived in Uruguay, Anita taught Garibaldi the style and manner of the legendary gaucho horsemen, the spiritual descendants of Jose Felix Ribas, if that name is familiar from one of our various detours during our episodes on Spanish-American independence. So it was while in Montevideo that Garibaldi adopted his signature look of wearing a poncho and a sombrero that was traditional to the gaucho but really made him stand out back in Italy. They didn't last long in the quiet life, though, as the Rio de la Plata was engulfed in one of its various treacherous and endlessly confusing multi-factional civil wars. Garibaldi wound up volunteering to raise a legion of his fellow Italian exiles to fight for one of the sides, don't worry about which one, and from 1842 to 1848 he successfully led the naval defense of Montevideo, and on land continued to learn and perfect styles of guerrilla warfare. But events back in Italy were nearest to his heart, and Garibaldi was in frequent contact with friends and comrades back home. The elevation of Pope Pius IX in 1846 sent his heart aflutter, and then when he got news of the early rebellions in Sicily and Naples in January and February of 1848, he said to himself, "This is it." So Garibaldi and Anita collected about 60 men. They quit their service in the South American Civil Wars, and they sailed for Italy. By the time they arrived and got situated, the First War of Italian Independence was already underway, and led by none other than King Charles Albert, whose death sentence had once hung over Garibaldi's name. Now Garibaldi was willing to put this all aside, but the king was not. So when Garibaldi presented himself to the king as a willing volunteer, promising to obey every order, the king rebuffed his advances. He simply refused to forget that Garibaldi had once risen up against him. So, rejected by the king, Garibaldi struck back up with Mazzini, and they both decided not to follow Charles Albert back to Piedmont. Now, the relationship between Mazzini and Garibaldi was, at this point, still pretty good, and Garibaldi willingly took orders from Mazzini after the fall of Milan. But their relationship would become increasingly strained, as Mazzini was now done trusting or compromising with monarchists, while Garibaldi was, still now, willing to swallow his own principles for what he thought was the greater cause of liberation and unification. But Garibaldi was then immediately disillusioned with Mazzini's plan to carry on the war in northern Lombardy. Garibaldi and the 800 or so men that followed him entered and occupied the small city of Luino in August of 1848, but as they tried to rally recruits, they were met only with indifference. It may now be a people's war, but it kind of seemed like the people weren't that into it. Dejected, Garibaldi withdrew back across the border to Switzerland. But as he did, most of the men under his command took a look around and concluded that there was no point to any of this. So Garibaldi's 800 men was soon down to just 30. For the moment, the war in Lombardy was over. The Austrians had won. So, with the war over in Lombardy, that left only Venetia still fighting. And even then, it was not Venetia. It was just Venice. All the mainland territories had been overrun by Austrian forces, leaving only the city of Vienna holding out behind a cordon of about 9,000 Austrian troops on land and a naval blockade out at sea. Venice then became a symbol and a rallying point for all men and women who wanted to keep fighting. So refugees, volunteers, and deserters from all the other Italian states trickled into the city. Roman, Neapolitan, Tuscan, Lombard. In all, Venice absorbed about 12,000 such patriotic immigrants, and soon the city boasted about 22,000 men under arms. Their commander-in-chief was our old friend, General Guglielmo Pepe. After Naples had ordered Pepe to come home, he had instead, remember, gone rogue and led a contingent of patriotic Neapolitan troops into Venice, arriving at the city on June the 15th. Upon his arrival, Pepe's skill and sound patriotic politics made him the easy choice to lead Venice's defenses. Despite being surrounded, though, the city was incredibly well defended by a dense network of more than 50 different forts that made a calculation for direct assault balloon in terms of the time, resources, and casualties it would take, and the Austrians really couldn't afford time or resources or casualties. Plus, the not quite 10,000 men on the mainland were suffering from a bout of malaria that would linger for months. And the naval blockade, well, it was hardly a blockade at all. The Austrian navy was not in great shape at the moment, and the local Venetians knew the tricky waters around the city just much, much better, and so blockade running was a pretty easy game to play. So, though Venice was besieged, you could kind of come and go as you please, if you wanted. As to the political leadership of Venice, after the vote to fuse with Piedmont in early July, a new monarchical provisional government had established itself. Except, remember, Venice had finally voted to fuse with Piedmont just a few weeks before Charles Albert got beat and ran away. So it was with some absurd embarrassment when, on August the 7th, the provisional government welcomed a small commission of royal agents representing Charles Albert. They had come to begin the process of fusion and integration, to make Venice a province of Piedmont. Except, Piedmont just got beat by the Austrians, so what are you guys even doing here? The arrival of the commissioners triggered a showdown over who would really rule Venice, because it probably wasn't going to be Charles Albert. The commissioners and the provisional government were challenged most especially by hardcore Republican allies of Giuseppe Mazzini, who formed what they called the Italian Club, and their plan was to not just reject the planned fusion with Piedmont, but also to form an uncompromising hard rock republic in Venice. They drew many of their adherents from the quote-unquote foreign population of the city, that is, from the patriotic volunteers who had come from elsewhere, as opposed to the native population of Venice. Those people were, after all, the ones most committed to the fight. Occupying the middle ground between the provincial government and the Italian Club was Daniele Manin. Ironically, Manin's failure to stop Venice from voting to fuse with Piedmont allowed him to come back stronger than ever. He had refused to serve in the provisional government and refused to support fusion with Piedmont, and so he was untainted by Piedmont's ultimate defeat. But Manin also thought Mazzini and the Italian Club were too extreme in both rhetoric and tactics, and so though he was a staunch Republican, Manin thought the Italian Club was a threat. He was in that camp of radical liberals or liberal radicals who were afraid that extremist rhetoric would alienate more than they would bring in. Plus, the implied threat that the Republic of Venice was just the beginning of a project to spread republicanism until every other polity in Italy was wiped off the map, well, that was no way to get allies at a time like this. So Manin planted himself to the left of the failing provisional government and to the right of the rising Italian Club. On August the 10th, Manin personally led a protest to the provisional government demanding that the Venetian Assembly be recalled to redecide the issue of fusion with Piedmont in light of recent events. In the meantime, the radicals were busy harassing the royal commissioners and making their lives miserable every time they showed their faces in public. On August the 11th, the provisional government said that the Venetian Assembly could reconvene, and the royal commissioners resigned from their posts. But the commissioners were not out of physical danger. Later that same day, they were spotted in St. Mark's Square, and a mob that was on its way to becoming a lynch mob surrounded them. Friends located Manin at a nearby bookshop and begged him to help calm the situation. So Manin rushed to the square, got up on a balcony, and did everything he could to ease tensions. The gist of what he said was that the commissioners aren't worth it. We've already won. The assembly will convene on August the 13th, and in the meantime, I will personally hold emergency power. And that was enough for the crowd. They forgot the commissioners and they shouted, "Viva Manin!" and "To the forts!" So, without much premeditation, Manin had just led an improvised and bloodless coup. The provisional government stepped aside, and though he was never called this or held the official title, most histories mark August the 11th, 1848, as the beginning of the dictatorship of Daniele Manin. So as we've seen, King Charles Albert's defeat at Custoza marked the increased confidence of radical Republican voices across northern Italy, and this was true also in central Italy, and most especially in Rome. Now, radical Republicans had been giving the Pope fits ever since his allocution had been published at the end of April. His betrayal of the cause of liberation and unification had galvanized the radicals, and Rome had become a city roiled by civil unrest. On June the 5th, the first Roman parliament had convened under the new civil constitution, and they immediately declared their support for national liberation, whatever the Pope said. But their vision of unification still centered around the Pope. Most of them supported a federal league of Italian states with the Pope at the center. But this plan was blasted by more radical voices. I mean, the papal allocution has made it pretty clear that that is not going to fly. The Roman radicals were further galvanized on July the 14th, because in the week leading up to the final showdown at Custoza, the Austrians had violated the sovereignty of the papal states. They crossed the border and they occupied the city of Ferrara. The radicals demanded that the Pope and the Parliament declare a state of emergency and then a state of war, a demand that was backed by a mob rushing into the Parliament and shutting them down for an entire session. Plenty of radical volunteers were also now streaming north on their own initiative to join the fight, despite the Pope's denunciation of the war. So the Pope's liberal ministry attempted to just avoid the issue entirely, but they could not. When news of the Battle of Custoza arrived, the ministry all resigned on August the 3rd. Yet another liberal ministry felled by the failure of Charles Albert. This led to the work of government grinding to a halt, as a showdown loomed between radicals who wanted to figuratively, if not quite literally, storm the gates of government, and conservative liberals who wanted no part of any war with Austria, especially one that's losing, no part of any kind of republic, and a constitution that went no further than what had already been laid out in March. At the center of this conservative liberal group was Count Pellegrino Rossi. Now 61 years old, Rossi had an interesting career. Originally a Bonapartist, he had gone so far as to support Joachim Murat in his last-ditch effort to stay in power, and when that failed, Rossi had gone into exile, first to France and then to Switzerland, where he established himself in the 1820s and 1830s as a preeminent professor of law. After the July monarchy was founded, Rossi migrated over to France and found a lot of like-minded conservative liberals now running the country. He got a job as a diplomat in France's foreign ministry, working under François Guizot, and this paved the way for Rossi's return to Italy in 1845 to serve as a French agent in the Papal States, which soon led to his appointment as the official French ambassador to the Papal States. And it was in this capacity as a diplomatic agent of France that he met and advised the new Pope, Pius IX, and it turns out the two shared a lot in common, and Rossi became a trusted voice. The February Revolution of 1848 in France, though, toppled the regime Rossi served, and it cut him loose and turned him into a free agent, and so he remained in Italy, he remained in Rome, as the revolution swept through. He advised the Pope to accept constitutional government, and himself held that vision of a federal union of Italian states led by the Pope as the ultimate expression of Italian unification. But he also counseled moderation, and was an avowed opponent of Mazzini-style republicanism, and his disdain for them was matched by their disdain for him. When word got out that the Pope was going to make Rossi prime minister, the Republicans found this abhorrent. They had to resist it at all cost. So it forced a 6-week interregnum where the streets threatened to explode if Rossi was appointed, and the Pope refusing to consider anyone else. But as the radicals and the Republicans were gaining steam in north and central Italy, southern Italy was already in the grips of a conservative counter-revolution. Please recall that King Ferdinand of the Two Sicilies had cracked down hard on liberals and radicals in Naples on May the 15th. He ordered the army to beat their way into control of the capital and then ditch the Neapolitan parliament before it could even convene. But despite all this, the king and his conservative ministers believed that they had to tread somewhat lightly. So they blamed the disturbances of May on a few irredeemable rabble-rousers, and far from eliminating constitutional government, the king promised that most civil rights would remain in place and a new parliament would convene in mid-June. The concern here was that they didn't want to get too far out ahead of themselves. I mean, what if Charles Albert actually beat the Austrians in the north? They may have to tack again back towards constitutional government. Don't want to risk getting overthrown here. But after word of the Battle of Custoza arrived, the king felt stronger than ever. A new parliament convened with the lower house showing strong liberal tendencies, but now the king's ministers just ignored them. They didn't bother to show up for debates at all, and they paid no mind or attention to the speeches the delegates gave. The king was already back to focusing on his one true obsession at this point, the need to reassert control over the island of Sicily. I mean, here he was, the king of the two Sicilies, and he didn't even have one Sicily to his name. Now, we haven't talked at all about Sicily since episode 7.7, but remember, it was the Sicilian revolt in January of 1848 that really started the Italian constitutional fire that swept the peninsula. The Sicilian uprising had also forced almost the entire Neapolitan army off the island, only failing to dislodge one last garrison from the fortress at Messina. Well, since then, a Sicilian parliament had met in Palermo in March and demanded from King Ferdinand a constitution for Sicily that would give them virtual independence from Naples. That we are willing to share a sovereign, but that's it. When the king wouldn't have it, the Sicilian parliament voted in April to depose him. Now, the deposition of the king, though, led not to a republic, but to a search for a new royal dynasty to come replace the fallen Bourbons. Now, luckily also for Sicily, events in Naples and elsewhere in Italy meant that they did not face an immediate counter-invasion, as King Ferdinand was forced to bow to pressure to send some troops up to Piedmont, and then even after those troops were recalled, to keep his forces close at hand while he reasserted control of his mainland kingdom. By the end of August, though, the king was starting to feel pretty good, and he mustered 10,000 men for an invasion. The plan was to sail for Messina, relieve the beleaguered garrison there, retake the city, and then use it as a beachhead for the eventual reconquest of the whole island. To make sure that he was not trifled with, the king prorogued the parliament. He dismissed a bunch of judges and state officials deemed unreliably liberal, and then he ordered a reduction in the rolls of the Neapolitan Civic Guard. The king wanted to focus on the reconquest of Sicily without having to watch his own back. On the 1st of September, the gunners in the fortress at Messina turned those guns on the civilian city and just started blasting away. Thus softened up, the 10,000-man invasion force crossed the Straits of Messina and landed outside the city. Now, most outright civilians were evacuating as fast as they could, but militant partisans forced the Neapolitans to retake Messina street by bloody street over multiple days of fighting. But at the end of that fighting, the Neapolitans claimed control of Messina. But by that point, it was virtually depopulated, and 2/3 of the city had been reduced to smoking piles of brick and mortar. The only thing that stopped the fighting was that the British and French were both mortified by the sudden shooting war that had erupted, and they stepped in to impose an armistice that would last for 6 months. Unable to stand up to British and French threats to desist, the king desisted. But Sicily would be his again, and he would rule it with the absolutism of the status quo ante 1848. So as you can see, entering the fall of 1848, there were a number of competing visions for what the future of Italy would be. King Ferdinand of the two Sicilies, of course, being among those who wanted to go back to the way things had been before. Up in Piedmont, though, the capital of Turin played host to a convention of liberal monarchists who gathered to discuss how a theoretical Kingdom of Italy might operate, with King Charles Albert as King of Italy, of course. It was mostly attended by the subjects of Charles Albert, including some of those refugees from Lombardy, but Venice did not send any delegates at all. They did not really recognize his claim to them. Their brief flirtation with fusion with Piedmont was over. But as I said, even by the time of this constitutional convention, it had been made very plain to Charles Albert that the armistice could not be the end of the line. If any of this was ever going to work, the king was going to have to go back to war with Austria at some point. If he wanted to stay on the throne, period, he was going to have to go back to war with Austria at some point. So, at this convention, the king addressed the assembly and made noises about how he wasn't happy with the way Austria was abiding by the armistice and that their provocations might become intolerable before too long. There was lots of cheering at this. Meanwhile, over in Venice, Daniel Manin was consolidating his control of Republican Venice. But there was no messianic expansiveness to his vision of republicanism, not like Giuseppe Mazzini. And this left him open to heavy criticism from Mazzini's allies in the Italian club, who were itching to overthrow Manin and set up their own harder core vision of what a Republican government ought to be. I should also mention that it was not going over too well that to help pay for his resistance to the Austrians, Manin had reinstated the hated tobacco tax. That, remember, had been one of the core complaints at the beginning of 1848. But though he was getting hammered daily, Manin had the support of the native Venetian population, but more importantly, General Pepe still supported him to the hilt. So Manin felt confident on October the 2nd when he ordered the arrest and deportation of a number of radical leaders, accusing them of undermining the war effort, and then he issued an order forbidding soldiers from participating in political clubs. But to cover his bases, Manin also announced a few days later that the non-Venetian population of the city, which had until then no formal participation in government, would be given the right to vote in upcoming assemblies. They were here, after all, defending the city. They ought to have a voice. This mix of carrot and stick, and most importantly, still continuing to hold the line against the Austrians, solidified Manin's Republican dictatorship, and it solidified his hold on Venice, even if it was not of the aggressively radical expansionist variety favored by the allies of Mazzini. Now, one of those allies who did honestly share Mazzini's vision, but who was willing to be a little bit looser and not be so strict about his extremism, was Giuseppe Garibaldi. Having concluded that the war in Lombardy was over, Garibaldi got into contact with the Sicilians. They took him up on his offer to come fight for them, but after getting on board a ship and sailing south, Garibaldi landed in Livorno, that radical city in Tuscany, and was convinced by the locals that Tuscany was ready to rise up, and that he could easily raise a Tuscan army and march it triumphantly into Naples. But Garibaldi was misled about the support he would receive from both the people and the local government of Tuscany. So, when Garibaldi arrived in Florence expecting to be given all the men and material he could ask for, and was instead greeted coldly by the government, he discovered that the radicals there were trying to prove that they could also govern, and they were not happy that this poncho-wearing revolutionary was asking them for men and arms so he could go gallivanting across the peninsula, burning everything to the ground. So now, diverted from Sicily, Garibaldi decided to make his way to Venice, where maybe somebody would actually accept his offer to fight for them. But while crossing the Alps, he found his path blocked by a small army sent specifically from the Papal States to bottle him up. So while huddling in the cold of the Apennines in early November 1848, Garibaldi started to really regret ever leaving South America. But while he was there huddling in November of 1848, he did get news that at least temporarily warmed his heart. So that segues us very nicely to the blowout of today's episode, and that is the dramatic events in Rome in November of 1848. Despite intense public pressure, the Pope finally pulled the trigger and invited his favorite Pellegrino Rossi to be prime minister. Rossi was first made Minister of the Interior on September the 10th, and then also Minister of Finance on September the 16th, so he really kind of had all the levers of power in his hand. Now, Rossi's object was to maintain as much as possible the Constitution of March and to keep the Papal States out of war with Austria, and then finally to suppress radical agents in the city. Rossi feared that a radical uprising in Rome would invite foreign intervention and turn Italy back into the battlefield of Europe, which he wasn't too wrong about. Upon taking office, he also tried to stabilize the government and make it more legitimate by dismissing obviously corrupt officials. He also reached out to Piedmont and Tuscany and Naples, about the feasibility of his own vision for the future of Italy, which was a papal-led Italian federal league, but he didn't get very far. As we've seen, everyone now has their own personal vision for what the future of Italy ought to be, and not too many now shared Rossi's. As the new prime minister settled into office, Rome endured an uneasy tension. The radicals did not immediately go into revolt, but they accused Rossi of first being a new Guizot, and then they moved on to calling him a new Metternich. The radicals were now reinforced by bitter veterans of the Northern War, who were ready to listen to more extreme rhetoric, and to reject compromising with those who wanted to just give up and tuck tail and run. Word of the Hungarian victories and the Vienna uprising in October then energized these radicals. Now was the time to be bold. Now was the time to go back to war. The Austrians are weak. Let's go back to throwing out the Austrians. But Rossi and the Pope were not having it. So the Republicans planned an insurrection for October the 24th, but it was busted because as many of the conspirators were government plants as real rebels. It sucks when that happens. Feeling very strong in his position, Rossi then cracked down hard on November the 12th. He identified radical leaders, they were arrested, and they were expelled from the city. In the wake of this, the few who remained behind met for a very dark meeting. They determined that Pellegrino Rossi had to be eliminated. In 3 days, a new Roman parliament would convene for its inaugural session. Rossi would be there, and if these conspirators had their way, he would never leave there. On November the 15th, 1848, the inaugural session of a new Roman parliament convened at the Cancelleria Palace. Large crowds attended the opening and swarmed around out in front. At about noon, Prime Minister Rossi arrived in his carriage and had to make his way on foot through the crowd that was packed out in front, and then the crowd that was packed even in the courtyard. He finally made his way to the staircase that would take him up to the parliament, but at the base of the stairs, he was accosted by a young man. As Rossi turned, another assailant lunged forward with a dagger and got Rossi right in the carotid artery. Blood spurted everywhere, and Rossi fell mortally stricken. But as it turned out, there was not 2 conspirators there that day, but dozens, perhaps hundreds. It's hard to tell, honestly, from reading the sources. But with the prime minister successfully hit, the rest of the conspirators pulled out their weapons, their daggers, and they mobbed out of the palace as a group. Everyone got away scot-free. Rossi, meanwhile, lingered briefly and then bled to death. The authorities were caught totally flat-footed. The parliament suspended its session. The Pope was himself devastated by the news. He was at his palace when he was told, and was described as being shocked, saddened, and silent. Meanwhile, out in the streets, the radicals were well organized, and they started leading street demonstrations. They demanded a new democratic ministry, a new constitution. They demanded war with Austria. The police and the civic guard were not keen on firing on the crowds, and their loyalty was now no longer certain. The rest of the ministry resigned en masse. By nightfall, the mobs were in control of Rome, and they were parading around hailing the assassin of Rossi as the new Brutus. The next day saw further action. Parliament was unable to function. Even as it reconvened, mobs kept storming in and out, disrupting everything and abusing anyone who wouldn't go along with their demands. In short order, most members of Parliament were either formally resigning or just leaving Rome without any kind of official word. Then in the afternoon, a crowd of about 6,000, most of them armed, mobbed out in front of the Pope's Quirinal Palace. Inside the palace, the Pope, equal parts depressed and angry, refused to consider the mob's demands. But finally, he relented to appointing a radical leader as prime minister, but he said he would go no further. But this was not enough. Some in the crowd tried to light one of the gates of the palace on fire. The Swiss guards out in front fired over their heads as warning, but those in the crowds with guns started shooting up the palace. They started shooting out windows, and they killed at least one secretary inside. They were now shouting for a democratic ministry or a republic. In the face of this, the Pope yielded, and he elevated into the ministry a number of radical leaders who could only frankly at this point be considered his personal enemies. This ministry then published a new platform. They would call for a constitutional convention, and they would plot renewed war with Austria. The Pope was able to endure all of this for, just about a week, most of which I imagine he spent trying to figure out how to get out of Rome. On November the 24th, the Pope disguised himself as a common parish priest. He got into a nondescript carriage, and he bolted from Rome. He rode 12 straight hours towards the Kingdom of Naples, finally arriving in the port city of Gaeta before anyone back in Rome knew that he was gone. There, he established the papacy in exile and argued, not unreasonably, that he remained the true defender of constitutional government, that he still now, and would in the future, abide by the constitution he had agreed to in March. And with the prime minister assassinated, the parliament broken up by mobs, and a new ministry elevated with the help of guns and bullets, whatever was going on in Rome sure as hell wasn't constitutional government. The flight of the Pope from Rome would set up another bona fide international incident in 1848, as Catholic Europe was shocked that the Roman people had driven the Pope out of town, and these Catholic leaders planned to meet in conference to figure out what, if anything, could be done. And though shocked, the Habsburgs up in Vienna were secretly thrilled by the news, as it further cleaved the political revolutionaries from the Catholic faithful. It was hard to argue now that the Republicans weren't an enemy of Catholicism. And then there was certainly no way that the Pope was ever going back to the cause of liberation and unification. The man who had once been thought of as the political and spiritual leader of Risorgimento, whose portrait had been hung on the barricades of Milan, was now staunchly headed towards counter-revolution. But by the time the Pope was making his formal entreaties to Austria for aid, and he will do that, there would be a whole new emperor. Multiple competing factions maneuvering around an incapable emperor had been a recurring cause of the Habsburgs' inability to respond effectively in 1848, and it was no longer tolerable. But that story will have to wait for 2 weeks, because next week we will make our return to France, which we have not visited since episode 7.19, and the suppression of the radicals during the June days. So, we will need to review the Republic's struggles to maintain firm footing on what seemed like endlessly shifting sands, but mostly we will focus on the first presidential election in French history, which was scheduled for December of 1848, and featuring as its leading candidate none other than Louis Napoleon Bonaparte.